Well, a weightless Wacky rig is probably one of the most popular presentations in the bass fishing world, especially for new anglers because it works and it's pretty easy to present. But there are some definite benefits and there are some definite negative aspects of fishing a Wacky rig. And I'm going to try to give some solutions for the cons or the negatives so you can get more out of your Wacky rig fishing. But let's start with the pros because we can go through these pretty quick. Number one, it catches a ton of fish. I mean, a Wacky rig just catches fish. It is something that the top level professionals use all the way down to anglers that have never bassed fish before. Number two, it is easy to rig and easy to use. It's pretty hard to mess up a Wacky rig. Yes, we can have it not centered right, but it's a fairly forgiving presentation, and that is why it is so popular with such a wide range of anglers. Speaking of anglers, that's number three. It's excellent for new bass anglers to throw. If you're trying to introduce somebody to the sport, which I hope you are, a weightless Wacky rig is a good one to start off with. You can almost guarantee they're going to get a bite with it. Number four, it's effective just about on any body of water from coast to coast, top to bottom, even in a wide range of water clarities. The Wacky rig is something that works everywhere. Number five, it is a dynamite shallow water technique. No argument there. And number six, the Wacky rig is really easy to skip, especially on spinning gear. You can just, boom, just shoot it right up underneath brush or docks. Okay, we could probably all agree on those 6 pros or benefits of a Wacky rig, right? That's why a lot of us fish it. Now let's talk about some of the negative aspects or the cons. Number one, it can be pretty slow to fish. It can take a long time for that lure to sink, and it's not a lure in a weightless Wacky rig that you can just cover a ton of water with. Well, my easiest solution for that is to throw a weighted Wacky rig. I've talked about it quite a bit here on the channel. I just use a simple insert jig head, okay, an insert tube jig head, I should say. Just go ahead and work that right through the bait, and it alters the fall rate, speeds it up. Now I can cover a lot more water much quicker. Number two, the Wacky rig can be pretty hard to fish in deep water. Well, once again, using a weighted Wacky rig and also choosing a model that is heavily salt impregnated will help that sink rate and get it to the depths much quicker. Now there's a big difference between salt impregnated and salt added. Okay, if it's just a salt added lure, it's only going to be there on the surface. But if it's salt impregnated, you can actually just slightly gently pull that lure apart and you will see the actual granules of salt inside that plastic. The salt impregnated lures are going to sink. The density is different. The lures that have the salt added, that's just more for trying to give some taste to the bass, and it washes off there pretty quick, and it's really not going to change the sink rate. Next one, the number three negative aspect of a Wacky rig or a con is sometimes those bites can be like really hard to detect. So the easiest way I have found for this is to try to make it visual as well. I like to use a high-vis braid, and then if I'm clear water, use a leader, monofilament, fluorocarbon, whatever it might be. But that high-vis braid just gives the angler the ability to use a second sense, the sense of sight, as well as feel. So if you're having a hard time detecting bites on a Wacky rig, try that high-vis braid. I think you'll find it very helpful. The fourth negative aspect to a weightless Wacky rig is everybody throws it. So you can go ahead and get to a lake or river and have 5 anglers in front of you and they're all throwing the same thing. Well, I'm a huge fan of doing something different. So there's a couple things that you can do as an angler to maybe separate yourself from all those other boats ahead of you or the anglers on the shoreline that are throwing that weightless Wacky rig. One, you can, of course, add the weighted Wacky rig. That's probably the number one thing that I will do. But you can also vary the size. There are stick baits out there that are longer and shorter than your traditional 5-inch, so you can definitely change that. But here's the big one. Most of the time people will just let that lure do its thing as that Wacky rig is dropping, and it gets to the bottom and they reel it in pretty quick. Once it gets to the bottom, leave it sit there a second. Give it just a tiny twitch, 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 leave it sit. Twitch, twitch, leave it sit. The bass don't always hit it on the drop. They do a lot of times, but there are days when they want it all the way on the bottom. They'll see it falling and they'll watch it and they'll drop it. And then it's sitting there on the bottom and they'll really come up and kind of turn over on one side and take a look at it. So if you've got a situation where it seems like everybody's throwing that weightless wacky rig, make sure you leave it sit there on the bottom just a few seconds. I think you're going to pick up some bites that maybe the others are missing. The next negative aspect to a weightless wacky rig are there are days when you are going to clean house on the 1-pounders. Well, don't get me wrong. Most of the times when I hit the water, if I'm just catching fish, I'm a pretty happy guy. But there are times I'm like, man, another 12-inch fish? I want to catch a good one. Well, there's a couple things that you can do there. You can back off a little bit deeper and then let that wacky rig go ahead and drop and get to some deeper water. That's definitely a way to help eliminate those little fish from chasing it, because they will just annihilate that thing. And the other thing that we can do with that wacky rig is try to pick off and identify those subtle pieces of cover, that single stick that is sitting there, that tiny little clump of weeds. Big weed bed over here, hit that tiny clump of weeds. And usually if we do that, the quality or the size of the bass that we catch starts to inch its way up. And the sixth negative aspect to a wacky rig is, I'm telling you, you can go through a ton of baits, and probably all of you have experienced this at some point in time. There's a few things that you can do with it. You can go ahead and use the Elastec type baits. That is going to change your sink rate because they are very, very buoyant. If you get some salt-impregnated Elastec, they're definitely going to fall better. But there's baits out there where you throw a weightless wacky on Elastec and it just sits on top of the water. So be aware, you may have to add some weight to it or find the salt-impregnated, and the sink rate could be much, much, much slower, but the Elastec will last way longer and you'll catch many more fish on it. So that's one thing that you can do. But there's also some products out there that are pretty handy. A lot of us have seen the traditional O-ring method where we slip that bait through the O-ring, put your hook under it. But there's also crossover rings out there. VMC makes these crossover rings. And then there are also some saddles out there that are actually like 2 O-rings that are connected. Either of these, I find, they secure the bait pretty good. Now with the crossover ring, they're going to come out this winter sometime. You got to make sure you have the right diameter, okay? Because there's a lot of stick baits that have varying diameters, so it'd be a good idea to buy several different sizes. But those 2 products, and especially that saddle, can help keep your baits longer. So they're definitely, I think, a worthy investment. And hey, speaking of using more of a subtle technique and, you know, having a slow time covering water, or not covering water as much as we would like, what about a drop shot? Have you ever fished a power shot rig? If not, go ahead and check this video out right here. And don't forget to go out and encourage someone today. You never know how you might just change their life. For the Bass Fishing Life, I'm your host, Steve Rogers.